Hi, fellow South Bay Civil War Roundtable members. Dana Lombardi here, giving you a talk on a book that I helped edit by Neil Chatelain, published by Savas Beatty. Ted Savas, a colleague and friend, asked me to help edit this book that was in the works about a year ago and has since come out, as you can see. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. The PowerPoint presentation that Neil put together gave me permission to give to you so that you understand what's in the book, what's the background of this. It's a book about the Confederate Navy and the battles for the Mississippi River and the tributaries. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background, and then we're going to start the PowerPoint. So Neil Chatelain is an adjunct professor of history at Lone Star College, North Harris. He's also a former U.S. Navy surface warfare officer. Neil's book is the first one that's a complete story narrative about the battles in the Civil War for control of the Mississippi River Valley. Now, some of the books out there have done a great job on specific battles and occasional campaigns, but Neil's book is the first one that tells the complete story about the entire war, not only on Mississippi River, but the tributaries and distributaries that flow into and out of it. The official records, of course, are very important, but they're not really a narrative. They're a collection of documents. So again, Neil has been able to put this all together as a narrative, a story about the Confederate Navy during the Civil War. And that's why this book is so important. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and start in. Okay. So as I mentioned, the book is called The Defending the Arteries of the Rebellion, or Confederate Naval Operations in the Mississippi River Valley. I'm Dana Lombardi, and I'm the one who edited the book. I'll tell you something a little bit about being an editor and what that basically is all about and how I helped Neil with his book. But I'll do that at the end of our talk. Right now, let's get into the story in the PowerPoint. So Mississippi River Valley area is huge, as you can see, and basically the forts that the Confederates had initially built in the first part of the war at Fort Henry and Donelson, which very famous campaign that Grant started, Fort Pillow and Fort Randolph, closer to Memphis, Fort Pemberton and Fort Heidemann, and of course down at the very entrance of the Mississippi empties into the Gulf of Mexico, and Forts Jackson and St. Philip were built to protect New Orleans, and Fort Livingston to protect the Louisiana coast. And you can see all of the tributaries and distributaries that flow into and out of the Mississippi River Valley. There are quite a few, and these are going to be fought over all the way until the very end of the Civil War. I'm not going to go through every one of them right now. You'll see as they come up in the campaigns and the battles as we go through the PowerPoint. So what were the Confederate Navy ambitions and growth? Basically, they had to build a country from scratch. They had to build a navy and an army from scratch. There was nothing in existence that was, especially at sea, that was a military naval force that they could use. So they had to figure out how to even build things at the beginning. And if you'll notice that at Pensacola, Florida, there was one shipyard. Mobile, Alabama was one. Savannah, Georgia was one. Norfolk, Virginia, the very famous one where the Virginia Ironclad was built. But the Mississippi River Valley had 7 shipyards. That's really important because you can see that it had the most potential for creating a Confederate Navy quickly. And they did so primarily at New Orleans. There were 3 shipyards there: Plaquemine, Louisiana, Brashear City, Louisiana, Memphis, Tennessee, and Nashville, Tennessee. These were the locations where they had the shipyards that they could use to build their Navy. And the Ironclad program was going to be a huge part of that, obviously. As you may remember, that Virginia fights the Monitor at Hampton Roads in Virginia. But their program really was primarily based on the Mississippi River Valley. If you take a look at it, South Carolina had 2 Ironclad programs underway from April of '61 to March of '62. Virginia, of course, that's where the the Virginia was built. Mississippi River Valley, again, there were 9, as I mentioned. Memphis had 2, Tennessee River had 1, and New Orleans, of those shipyards, 7 shipyards, they had 6 ironclad programs underway at the beginning of the war. So what were they going to do about this? This is what the Confederate Navy had in plans. So the ironclad construction programs were really, really the key to their future. They knew that they couldn't stand up against the United States Navy. They didn't have purpose-built frigates or warships, wooden warships, that they could rely on or get into service quickly enough. So the ironclads were their biggest hope that they had, and that was a priority for them to get those ironclads built as quickly as they could. And New Orleans, which had most of the shipyards, was set to expand beyond those 6 and become a focal point of naval activity on the river valley. And really that was going to help the entire Confederacy, because the New Orleans area was already ready to go, and they didn't have to try and build new shipyards there. But they were going to anyway. They're going to expand the existing shipyards and build some new ones. They also had at New Orleans a marine hospital on the CSS St. Philip. In other words, they had a floating hospital. And they also had a naval laboratory. What does a naval laboratory do? Well, basically, they make the friction primers, the shells, the powder, and other ordnance items. And the friction primers were what actually fired the cannon. So being able to make all these things was a key element, and it was one of the few places where the Confederates could do that at the beginning of the war. The civilian shipyards, however, were obviously experienced making civilian ships, not warships. And so they had to figure out how to do that. And so the Confederate government would send naval experienced men down there to supervise it and try and do a couple of ways of building up the Confederate Navy quickly. There was also a massive southern shoe factory making 250 pairs of boots daily. I mention that just so you understand that New Orleans was far more than just a shipbuilding center, and being able to make that many shoes in New Orleans every day was a huge boost and important to the Confederacy. There were also 4 ironworks or foundries where they could cast cannon and boilers and all of the metal pieces needed to make not only the ironclads, but also that needed to be put on warships or converted civilian steamers. The overall takeaway was basically really simple. The Mississippi River was the major priority of the Confederate Navy's efforts in the war's first year. It highlighted basically the importance of the river and also the importance of New Orleans specifically. So let's go to the next one. One of the most important things about the Confederacy that is often overlooked. We know about what their generals did, their naval forces did. We know about the campaigns and the other things, but it's rarely not talked about how important the slaves were to making all this possible. There were skilled craftsmen among the slaves who were capable of doing the things needed to build ships and to make equipment and boilers and mechanical devices. And these skilled craftsmen were, quote, hired out, unquote, by their masters, who got paid for their work, but they were hired out to do this work. They also augmented shipyards in large ships. There were, like, at just one of the shipyards called Algiers in New Orleans, there were 300 slaves in one shift alone, 300. So you can see how important slaves were to building up the infrastructure and the back logistics side of the Confederacy. Plus, the plantation infrastructure and machinery was also useful. The constructing, supporting fortifications. In other words, somebody had to dig all those fortifications and the breastworks and the trenches and basically the earthworks that supported the defensive areas all along the Mississippi River. And this is what is really surprising. Neil was able to find that there were slaves that were used in augmenting this warships. In other words, crewmen on the warships. There weren't a lot, but they also served on some of the ships in order to fight the United States naval vessels as they came and tried to take over the Confederate ports and the river. So the Mississippi River Campaign, we're going to take a look at what happened in 1861. This is the first part of it. So out of New Orleans, the civilian contractors and the men who were able to either bring their own ships or who knew how to sail ships or lead sailors on a ship, they immediately went privateering. They got a letter of marque from the Confederate government that gave them the ability to go out and seize any ship they could find that was flying the United States flag. They captured it, came back with their prize. It was sold in court, and then the captain and the crew were given a portion of the sale. So that happened right away. Ship Island, if you take a look at it, you see an explosion there. The red explosion is where the Confederates were able to keep the United States naval forces at bay, so they couldn't reach the ports, the minor ports, the minor area of Biloxi and Pass Christian, and they couldn't come in the back way on New Orleans. So that was successful, but that wasn't going to stay that way because initially the United States Navy just did not have enough vessels to enforce the blockade that Lincoln wanted to impose upon the Confederacy. They simply did not have enough ships, and the Confederates were able to, at least initially, defend their areas along the Mississippi and the Gulf. There were some minor things up along the Mississippi at the northern end, near New Madrid and Columbus in Kentucky. This ended up being a disaster for the Confederates, though, because Leonidas Polk moved his Confederate forces into Kentucky, which had declared its neutrality, and because he was worried that the Union were going to seize the area anyway, that the Confederates should do it, he did that without consulting Jefferson Davis or the government in Richmond, and that led to the government and the governor of Kentucky calling for help from the United States. So Kentucky fell, the entire state, to the United States just because of that blunder. Then the head of passes, let's go back down to the south at the entrance to the Gulf. And you can see the head of passes, the Confederates, again, were able to stave off the initial United States warships that came up or tried to come up the Mississippi. Belmont, back up north we go, and there is where United States Grant had his first action, unsuccessful. He bloodied the Confederates, but he was forced to retreat back to Cairo, and that was another success for the Confederates. So far they're holding off the Union attempts to gain a foothold along the Mississippi further and up toward New Orleans. And then, of course, coastal Louisiana, you can see that people don't know how important that is, but in addition to the Mississippi, you can see that the two rivers that lead out into the Gulf and also Brasher City was another place that they could send supplies from the Trans-Mississippi to the Eastern Confederate States or out to Europe. And then finally, obviously, both the Confederates and the Union forces are doing everything they can to construct as many new ships as they possibly can. Confederates in particular are focused on ironclads, but they're also, both the North and the South, are doing as much as they can to convert civilian craft to military purposes. But that is going to be really difficult, and it's going to be a mess for the Confederates, and here's why. They had a huge organizational problem in that you can see the list of all those organizations that had to be supervised, organized, and maintained on the Confederate side. They had a new Navy and Marine Corps, which was a priority. They had a revenue service. What is that? That's basically vessels that cause, they basically collect taxes by going and hitting import duties and things like that are critical. The United States, for example, have been doing that for years, and a good part of the United States budget was the income from revenue service, basically charging taxes on import fees and duties. The Army, of course, also had a big part of this because they had forts and cannon and supplies they had to maintain, and they had to coordinate that with the Navy and Marine Corps, but they didn't answer to the Navy or the Marine Corps. There was a river defense fleet. Okay, this is a little bit complex, but basically the bottom line is that the river defense fleet was a combination of the Navy and the Army, basically creating a defense fleet that could help them both or serve them both. That wasn't always going to work out well, as you can imagine, but they did at least try to do that. The privateers, as I mentioned before, and if that wasn't enough, the Louisiana Navy wasn't happy with the way the Confederate government was doing things in their state, so they decided they were going to create their own navy, and so they started building their own ships and hiring their own crew and captains and so forth. Also, the government, the Confederate national government contracted civilian steamers, so that was in addition to the Army, the Navy, privateers, and Louisiana Navy. They're all trying to compete for resources, for crew, for workers, and supplies and equipment. And then finally, the blockade runners, which are all trying to come in by running off to Europe and getting as many supplies as they can, were pretty independent, very much like the privateers, but they didn't really answer to anybody, and they would also compete for crew and captains and officers and supplies in order to get out. They had to burn coal and other things to get their ships to Europe and then bring everything back. So you can see that it's rather complicated. And this is on top of the fact that they're trying to create a new country. And by the way, the United States is trying to stop them, try to get rid of this, and try to prevent them from getting too strong before they get too strong. So the people that involved in this, and I'm going to I'll mention a few of them, as you can see there. Captain George Hollins commanded the Mississippi River Naval Squadron, okay? But when he was absent, Commander Pinckney commanded upriver and Commander Mitchell downriver. So these are men who had experience. But the problem is that Hollins really didn't leave any instructions for these guys, so they were pretty much on their own. Both Mitchell and Pinckney did whatever they wanted to, and they often didn't coordinate with each other or with the Army. So you had a problem, obviously, in command and leadership. Number two, William Whittle was the commander at the New Orleans Naval Station. He was responsible for ship construction. However, Whittle, who was responsible for building or converting all these ships, I'm sorry I don't have a picture of him, he was not in Hollins' chain of command. So Hollins had no way to influence Whittle, and Whittle just basically did whatever he wanted to. So you have all these guys off doing their own thing. The shipyard constructing the ironclads in both New Orleans and Memphis were owned and operated by civilians, just as the New Orleans shipyards in Algiers and Bayou St. John were basically owned and operated by civilians. In addition, the River Defense Fleet that I had mentioned before, that command was split. James Montgomery, which you can see, commanded the whole force. That's great. He commanded the entire force, but he took half the force upriver when there was a crisis up near Memphis, and he left John Stevenson commanding downriver. Stevenson hated the Confederate Navy and refused to obey their instructions. And the reason he did is because he built out of his own money the little baby ironclad, the ram Manassas, which was seized by the Confederate Navy in order for them to have another ironclad on the river. They did compensate him. Stevenson was compensated for this, but he was really unhappy with the Confederate Navy and the Confederate government, and he was not going to listen to what they wanted. And then finally, if one of the men that have been responsible for getting the contracts and supervising everything that was being purchased and built in New Orleans was Beverly Kennett. The reason he's important is he was fired, relieved of command, because of, let's just say that there was a special investigation done by Richmond when it was found that there was a huge overrun on the budget for the shipbuilding and equipment and everything, and it looked like Beverly was involved with some really serious corruption. So he was relieved. So guess who the Louisiana government hires to run their Navy? That's right, the disgraced Beverly Kennan, who is not about to cooperate with the Confederate Navy. So you can see that, you know, this is pretty much a really difficult organization or lack of organization that the Confederates are trying to get something going, both to build their ships, their ironclads, convert civilian steamers, find crewmen, find workers, find captains to run the ships. And I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that you know, this brand new government, this brand new country, this brand new Navy, Marine Corps, and so forth, suffered from these petty squabbles, corruption, incompetence, and the usual confusion and delays in trying to build all of this from nothing. What was surprising is how much the newly created Confederate nation, its Army and Navy, were able to accomplish in such a brief amount of time. And that's what Neil Chatelain shows in his book. So, if we look at operations, there were two parts to this. By the end of 1861, Confederate naval forces in the Mississippi River Valley were on paper, okay, this is important, on paper, gaining parity with their U.S. counterparts that were also trying to, up north, develop a river fleet. Now, you can see from the diagram, the planned force was 9 ironclads. It was 45 wooden steamers. Most of those were converted from civilian use, and 5 sailing vessels or floating batteries. What's a floating battery? Basically, it's a ship without any propulsion, whether it's sail or motor. They were basically floating batteries, literally, like it says. They were very much like what the U.S. was building in its gun and it's basically floating batteries that the Confederates had, and it was, excuse me for a second, I've lost my place. Mortar vessels, I'm sorry, mortar vessels. Basically, they also had to be towed. So they didn't have any sails, and they didn't have any equipment to turn propellers, and they had to be towed into position too. So there were ships that could propel themselves, and then there were the floating batteries and the mortar boats that could not. They needed someone to tow them or push them into place. Now, you can tell from the difference if you see what they had actually come up with by early 1862. The Confederates had 9 planned ironclads, but only 3 of them got finished. And they had 45 civilian steamers that they were trying to convert, but they only got 35 done. And they had 4 of the 5 floating batteries done by 1862. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that they were competing for limited resources, trained labor, and so forth. So they just weren't able to deliver. If you look at the United States plans, they had 29 mortar vessels planned, or excuse me, I need to correct that. These are what they actually were able to do by 1862. They had 29 mortar vessels. They had 25 wooden steamers. They had 10 ironclads done, ready in their Western gunboat flotilla, and 11 of the mortar vessels and 4 wooden steamers. And then there was a U.S. ram fleet, which were converted steamers, basically riverboats with paddles that propelled them. And they had 9 of those fitted with rams and with basically a lot of them were called cotton clads or timber clads because they didn't use iron. They used cotton bales and wood as their defensive armor, which was good usually against bullets, but not so good against cannon. And if you take a look at what the organizations had in the spring of 1862 for their campaigns then, the Louisiana Navy has its 2 ships. The River Defense Fleet, as I mentioned, has 14 vessels. The Revenue Service has 2 tax collecting vessels. The Confederate Army, that's right, the Army has 4 of its own vessels, and the Confederate Navy has 20. Most of those, again, are converted civilian, but a couple of them are ironclads. So let's look at the campaigns. In 1862, they got through 1861. They're trying like crazy to build as many Confederate ironclads and convert as many civilian steamers to military use. They've also built more forts, as you can see on the map in red. And so but what's going to happen is, despite their attempts to get all this done, they're going to have real problems with defending this with what they've got. And I'll go through that as we proceed. So initially in February, Forts Henry and Donelson, that falls. Blue explosions means success by the Union forces. It also forces the evacuation of Kentucky and the withdrawal of the Confederate naval forces in all this area, in the river areas down the Mississippi, back to defend New Madrid and Island Number 10. Which is the next step. And then March and April, Island Number 10 is besieged. And again, despite a spunky use of the Confederate naval forces that basically can defend well, and in fact, in the battles around Fort Pillow and Island Number 10, 2 Union ironclads are sunk by the rams that the Confederates have. But they fail, the Confederates fail to stop the bombardment at Fort Pillow, and the 2 sunken ironclads are later raised and repaired because the river, of course, isn't that deep. So initial success by the Confederates still ends up with a Union success. We pointed that out, Fort Pillow, the initial success there. And then Memphis, the Union forces had a battle against the River Defense Fleet, which is basically destroyed. The River Defense Fleet is destroyed at the Battle of Memphis by the United States fleets of City-class ironclads and the U.S. Ram fleet that was built. So this was a disaster. The entire northern end of the Mississippi River was basically, despite one success by the Confederates, was basically taken over and captured by the United States forces. Then the biggest disaster for the Confederates is New Orleans, which was their key city, the biggest city population-wise, and the one with the most manufacturing, largest population. The United States forces ran past Forts Jackson and St. Philip, and part of that was because the one ironclad that was not quite yet done, not yet built, the CSS Louisiana could not propel itself, but it came down and helped try to defend Forts Jackson and St. Philip. Unfortunately, because those forts were run past by the Union forces, the United States vessels, the ironclad had to be scuttled, had to be destroyed by the Confederates. Both forts surrendered, and then, of course, New Orleans itself was lost to the Confederacy. After that, in the Central Valley, there was, up the White River, there was a battle which the Confederates were unable to defend successfully, and St. Charles fell to the United States forces. They also, what's not shown here is the United States forces are also going overland with a sizable army to support the Navy, and they're working in conjunction, which the Confederates just never figured out how to do this properly. Their Army and their Navy fought separate battles. There was no overall commander trying to coordinate them, and they didn't know what they were supposed to do to coordinate their forces. So this ended up being a disaster, but they did succeed in defending Vicksburg. The initial attack at Vicksburg basically succeeds because the wooden ships mostly were lost on the Confederate side, but the one ironclad, the Arkansas, was completed, and it made a dash from where it was being built up the Yazoo River, up the Yazoo. You can see where Yazoo City is. And the Union failed to destroy it. So when it came down, it ran past the river fleet of the United States, armored vessels, the ironclads, and the wooden vessels. It got hit a couple of times, but it wasn't destroyed, and it damaged badly. It forced a couple of the ships to surrender, and it ran down to Vicksburg. And at that point, the Union decided to be cautious and was not going to try and take Vicksburg from the sea as long as the Arkansas was there to defend it. They also then tried to counterattack at Baton Rouge in August after they wanted to follow up their success. But unfortunately, this is where it all went bad for the Arkansas. The Arkansas was sent down to Baton Rouge to try and help recapture Baton Rouge, but it encountered engine problems, which is one of the reasons why the Confederacy is going to have such difficulty in building these ships and sustaining them and maintaining them. And so when it failed to have any self-propulsion, they just had to scuttle the Arkansas after it ran aground because it was going to be captured or destroyed by the Union forces from land as well as on the river. So the crew of the Arkansas helped to fortify Port Hudson. They moved off to Port Hudson, as you can see it on the map, and manned the guns there. And the U.S. Navy forces tried to pass that, but they weren't going to get away with it because they were hit repeatedly. And so you had this small gap between Vicksburg and Port Hudson where the Confederates still had that section of the Mississippi in their control in 1862. And we will get into the further parts of this Mississippi campaign next. So it's not just reconstituting the Confederate Navy forces, they had to rebuild it. They were gone. I mean, just about everything they had been trying to build in 1861 and early 1862 had been destroyed. Only a few vessels survived. And remember that they lost the shipyards in New Orleans and Memphis. And so they're down to basically Yazoo City in Mississippi and Shreveport, Louisiana. They rebuilt the flotillas on the rivers. The Red River has one ironclad and several steamers. You can see the other rivers, the Bayou, the Yazoo, the Arkansas River. You can see that most of them are just simply steamers with rams and either cotton-clad or timber-clad armor. There's a partial ironclad. Again, they're running out of supplies. They don't have enough to build complete ironclads on every one of these rivers, but they try to start on the Yazoo River. They have 3 projects that they've got going, and Biotech, they have another ironclad project. In addition to what I mentioned on the reconstituted flotillas, on the Tennessee River, there are 2 proposed ironclads that really never got off the ground. And the Red River, they have 1 additional ironclad that had been proposed. So despite the defeats, despite the fact that the United States had seized a vast area of the Mississippi River Valley and some of the tributaries and obviously the cities, they did not yet have control of the entire Mississippi in 1863, and the Confederates were working as fast as they could to rebuild their Confederate Navy on the river. So 1863, we go to the following campaigns. The Yazoo area, you see the Yazoo above Vicksburg. There were skirmishes along the river in December. Fort Heiman in Arkansas in January of 63. The Yazoo Pass expedition, which basically failed, was Grant's first attempts to take Vicksburg. And then Steele's Bayou in that expedition in March, and the Yazoo River down to Fort Pemberton, which again was stopped by the Confederates. So they basically were able to hold the United States forces at bay, but that was not going to last indefinitely. So for the rest of the war, the Confederates are still on the defensive, and it's going to be just a question of Who gives out first? Will the Union get fed up with trying to subdue the South? Will the South inflict enough losses and damage on the North that Lincoln's administration can be thrown out in 1864 election? And so these campaigns are really vital to who's going to control the United States in 1864 and beyond. So the first part is finally the Union wants to try and go up the Red River. And in 1863, and that fails primarily because of falling waters and really good leadership on the part of the Confederates. Something that's interesting about this is that the Indianola, which was and the Queen of the West, which was a steamer, a wooden steamer, and the Indianola, which was a river ironclad on the United States, both of those were lost when the Confederates, who did not have an ironclad at the time, decided to make a ship that looked like an ironclad, and it came down the river toward these vessels. And so the Indianola, which had grounded and was stranded, surrendered. But then the Confederates panicked and destroyed it when the Union forces, I'm sorry, I said Confederate forces earlier, when the Union forces basically dressed up a vessel to look like an ironclad and approached the captured vessel, the Indianola, which was still captured but had been grounded, and Confederates couldn't refloat it, and so the Confederates destroyed it. There was also skirmishes along Biotech. You can see that the Union was more successful there. You can see it above Brashear City in Louisiana. Then you have, I don't know if I can say this properly, Atchafalaya River. And I'm not even going to try and say that again. Anyway, the Confederates had success there to prevent the Union forces from reaching the Confederate squadron that is being built. Then we have the Arkansas River, which was more successful, and Little Rock was captured by the Union forces in 63. Then the Red River again, that also failed again. It's like the Red River is not going to fall to the Union forces till the end of the war. In fact, I think it holds out literally till the end of the war ends. And then the Yazoo River, that is successful. Grant finally gets the back door to Vicksburg sealed off. And then the White River, you can see that that's further up in Arkansas. That is a Confederate victory, which was partly due to the efforts of Nathan Bedford Forrest, very famous cavalry officer, who basically is able from the land side to force the surrender of the USS Undine and several transports, as well as the Johnsonville Supply Depot on the Tennessee River. So that basically, in fact, let me see. Yeah, now you can see it up there by Fort Donelson and Henry. That's where Nathan Bedford Forrest was operating. And before that, on the White River, you can see the red explosion near St. Charles. There was also Confederate cavalry there that captured and destroyed the USS Queen City. So, ironically, the most success the Confederates had was with their cavalry against United States naval vessels in 63 and 64. And then finally, the Hatchie River, you can see that also down in Louisiana and in 65. So in the final Red River operations, it holds out to the very end. So the Confederates defy the Union forces, the United States forces on the Red River, getting it to the end of the war. So let's do a quick summary. Basically, there were innovations that the Confederates did that were really important. They were being very clever, very smart about trying to fight an unequal war against the United States naval forces, which were vastly bigger. Same thing with the United States Army. And so the Navy had to come up with ways that were not traditional and were innovative, which included commerce raiding, which we mentioned, privateering, which was a separate type of commerce raiding was at sea. Basically, it was the four naval vessels that could sail for long periods at sea that would capture, in fact, United States whaling vessels were captured and either burned or basically surrendered to the Confederates. Privateering, as I mentioned before, which was everywhere in the Gulf and up and down the coast. The Confederates also did amphibious and joint operations. Despite the lack of cooperation and coordination that I mentioned in 1861 and early 1862, they were able to do some joint operations. The earliest one at Ship Island, I mentioned, Island number 10, New Orleans, they tried. Vicksburg was successful. Biotech and the Red River being the most successful of having amphibious joint operations. American ironclads, the Confederates were the first, although the Monitor came in very quickly, and then the ironclads, the river ironclads, the Union forces built on the Mississippi River, those also ended up overwhelming what the Confederates were able to do. So being first is not important here. It's who has the most resources. And then the ram, the Confederates brought back the ram because they didn't really have a choice. They didn't have that many cannon. And so the ram was very effective. As you may remember, I mentioned that Confederate rams sank two Union ironclads that were river ironclads in the early battles in 1861, although those were refloated later. They also had submersibles, which were basically, most famous one is the Hunley, which was a submarine. And it was a submersible because part of the vessel stuck out so they could see where they were going. So although most of the vessel was underwater, it wasn't a true submarine in the way we think of them today. But believe it or not, the first one was called the Pioneer 1. It was a 3-man submarine. It was under construction at New Orleans and unfortunately was scuttled before it could be used because the city was captured by Admiral Farragut in the spring of '62. But the Hunley, as I mentioned, which was built in South Carolina and Charleston, was able to successfully sink a Union vessel before it, in turn, was sunk by the concussion underwater. And then the ram fleet, not only the ram came back, but they had an entire fleet of ram vessels, which was copied immediately by the Northern forces. And then probably the most important and the one that we have heard the most about are the torpedoes, which today are obviously called mines, but back then they were called torpedoes, and hundreds of these were built or manufactured during the war, and they were very successful. They were extremely successful, more successful than the ship-to-ship efforts of the Confederate Navy. I'll go into that a little bit more in terms of how many of the vessels were damaged or sunk, and I'll just give you an example right now that are important for this discussion. So the first torpedoes were actually done in late 1861 on the upper Mississippi, up near Memphis and north of Vicksburg. And they were successful. They sank ironclads Cairo and Baron de Kalb and the Eastport. That's 3 ironclads between 1861 and 64. They also they damaged 3 United States wooden gunboats. They were damaged, but they weren't sunk, and they were easily repaired. Again, partly because the torpedoes did not carry enough gunpowder and explosives in order to do a big enough hole in the vessels. Often they would just be lightly damaged. They also weren't really heavy like ironclads, and so they didn't sink all the way to the bottom of the river. And hundreds of torpedoes were used at Columbus, Kentucky, Port Hudson, Fort Bisland, and on the Red River. Now, torpedoes overall didn't do that much damage or sinking that many U.S. vessels. They did more than the Confederate ironclads were able to sink, but they had a huge psychological impact. In other words, the torpedo fever, as it was called even then, was psychological, not real. But the psychology was that the Union Navy and the captains of the vessels were just very much afraid of these torpedoes everywhere. Despite the fact that they did not sink that many vessels, they were really, really worried about them. And so it helped delay operations, and also, like I said, it didn't take much to stop an entire squadron if one of the vessels ran into a torpedo. The most famous account of the torpedoes during the Civil War, as many of you may know, is the Battle of Mobile Bay in 1864. And although this wasn't on the river, the Union ironclad Tecumseh was sunk at the Battle of Mobile Bay, and Admiral Farragut allegedly shouted to his officers, "Damn the torpedoes," and then he ordered them full speed ahead past the forts to Mobile Bay. But otherwise, they really didn't do as much as they were the Union forces were afraid they were going to do. And everything you see there, as not only were they innovative and clever, but they just were not enough to turn back the huge advantage the North had in supplies, in material, in shipbuilding, in trained officers, in trained sailors, military sailors at the beginning of the war. So let's take a look at what all this meant. We're gonna show you the Confederate tactical victories during the battles along the Mississippi River Valley on the left, and then you'll see the strategic consequences on the right. I mentioned Ship Island, Mississippi, in July of 61, but the Confederates ended up having to abandon it. Seizure of Columbus, Kentucky. The Confederates captured it, but then had to give it up right away, and the Kentucky went to the Union immediately, which this was a disaster for the Confederates. They had passes way back down south of New Orleans. They held it. And they were able to keep the entrance to the Mississippi River closed for a while. But overall, the Mississippi River blockade into the Gulf was maintained by the United States forces. The defense and evacuation of New Madrid, Missouri, going back up north, was basically they were able to successfully defend initially, but then Island Number 10 was besieged and cut off, which meant that they had to eventually abandon Island Number 10. There was a battle after that at Plum Point Bend, where the two ironclads, Union ironclads, were sunk, but they were refloated, and the bombardment of Fort Pillow continued despite the success by the Confederate ram fleet. Then the Arkansas, which is built and under its own power, sails out into the Mississippi and basically causes consternation and damage, and even a few vessels, I think, sunk, captured on the side of the Union forces, and temporarily Vicksburg is saved. But then the Arkansas fails miserably at Baton Rouge, where it doesn't have any power, its engines break down, and it's forced to be scuttled. And then there is the defense of Biotech in 63. The Union loses the J.A. Cotton, and the Biotech is in Confederate hands to April of 63. So they're able to capture one of the Union ships and hold Biotech through April of 63. Then we go to the Red River operations, which the Union really botches, both the first and the second one. And the Confederates are able to capture the Queen of the West and the Indianola. And then the Red River is basically saved until the final Vicksburg siege in May of 63. Torpedo operations in the Yazoo River sinks the Cairo and Baron de Kalb. And Yazoo City, therefore, remains in Confederate hands until May of 63. And then the Red River campaign, again, the Union comes back. They failed to destroy the U.S., the Confederates failed to destroy the U.S. Mississippi River Squadron, but the Red River still is able to remain in Confederate hands into 1865. And then Forrest, Nathan Bedford Forrest, as I mentioned, does a major raid along the river up in Tennessee, and basically he sacks the Johnsonville Supply Depot, a huge depot, but the Confederates fail to recapture Tennessee. So this raid does a lot of damage, but it does no long-term benefit strategic consequences to the Confederates. And then finally, the sinking of the Queen City and St. Paul happened from Confederate efforts, but really they have no strategic implications. So let's take a look at what the root causes for Confederate failure were. And you can see that the USS Louisiana Ironclad was scuttled also to prevent its capture in that engraving from one of the accounts of the Civil War. Their organizational structure was a disaster. The number of different organizations operating in the Mississippi River Valley played a major role in its ultimate loss by the Confederacy. It became nearly impossible for them to coordinate naval operations between these organizations. There was no clear chain of command ever. Different organizations competed for manpower, resources, supplies, shipyards, and so forth. Plus, there were rivalry between elements of the River Defense Fleet and the Confederate Navy. As I mentioned, some of the officers simply wouldn't pay attention to their superiors. Supply management. Occasionally, there was good cooperation between all the numerous organizations, better than you would think. But there were also times where there was severe lack of cooperation, limited what the Confederates could do with their naval operations and any kind of coordination with the Army. For every successful cooperation at Vicksburg and Island Number 10, there was a lack thereof at Forts Jackson and St. Philip, or transporting supplies near Memphis. So it depended on who was on the spot on the Confederate side, and that just did not help the Confederates defend successfully anything that they needed to do to maintain some control of the Mississippi River Valley. One of the most important things that you have to understand is that the Union efforts here were incredibly aggressive. I mentioned, you can see that they were starting in February of 1862 to start pushing against the Confederates before the Confederates could get organized. In February of 1862, McClellan had still not felt he was organized enough or had an army ready to go against the Confederates in Virginia. They wouldn't really start until the spring, whereas the Union efforts knew they had to strike while they could, while they had the advantage. They knew they had an advantage in ironclads and in overall ship numbers and in leadership. And their leaders in the Navy, United States Navy, were very aggressive as compared to the Army, the United States Army, which was not up to the aggressive efforts on the same level as their naval officers were. Basically, the Union forces were better organized, better led, and both at the shipbuilding and supply level, as well as the combat level. And that included strategy, operations, and tactics. And that's why this was such a disaster for the Confederates. The final conclusions that Neil has, which I think are really important, is that there were ambitious plans by the Confederates for parity and riverine dominance. On paper, they almost got close on paper, but they just could never deliver on the actual reality of having ships built and operational and functional on the Mississippi River fast enough or long enough. The Mississippi River Valley was a cauldron of naval innovation, both by the Confederates and by the Union. So they were trying, and they were using as much smarts and innovation as they could. But this idea of the lost cause, Neil is very much an anti-lost cause person. He says that slavery, which is never talked about, was really critical to the Confederates, to the riverine efforts, to the Navy efforts, and to their fortifications. So the bottom line is that the Confederates just were outnumbered on every level. But despite all this, had they been better led, better organized, and maybe had husbanded their forces in a more intelligent way, they might have stood a real chance against the Union Navy. Obviously, that did not happen. I want to read to you a passage from Neil's book under his analysis and conclusions, because I think this is really important. It's not very long, and I'm going to make this brief, but this way you get an idea of why Neil's book is so important and some of the things that he has in his book. So this is from an epilogue, analysis and conclusions. Senior Confederate naval officers arrived in New Orleans in the war's opening days to acquire or construct suitable ships. In the first year of the conflict, an impressive shipbuilding program saw as many as 9 ironclads being developed in New Orleans and Tennessee, and dozens of wooden steamers converted into warships. By the campaign for New Orleans in late April 1862, only the small veteran 1-gun armored ram Manassas and unfinished 16-gun ironclad Louisiana were available to defend the forts guarding the city. By comparison, the United States launched 10 riverine ironclads with 124 heavy cannon total by February of 1862. 6 of these fought at Forts Henry and Donelson in February, just 6 months from when the construction contract was signed. From signature of the contract to, this is my little additional note here, is that I just want you to realize that this is back in the days when things took a long time to get going, and the Union were able, from signing a contract to launching ships and having them operationally fight at Forts Donelson and Henry only 6 months later. From signature on the paper, they're operational at a battle. Okay, back to the book. Confederate Secretary of the Navy Stephen Mallory did everything he could to match the Union effort. How then did the Confederacy fail in its goal to control its internal waterways? First, time was never a Confederate ally. Union campaigns along the Mississippi River in the spring of 1862 destroyed the Confederate ad hoc wooden warship fleet and erased the initial Confederate ironclad building program. Of the 9 planned ironclads, only the Manassas, Louisiana, and Arkansas saw combat in 1862. The remainder were captured by the United States or destroyed before their completion due to advancing enemy forces. Even these 3 were lost by the end of the year. Second, when New Orleans and Memphis fell to Union forces, the fate of the Mississippi River was sealed, and with it the end of the Confederacy's hope for large-scale naval riverine operations. Though a second round of ironclad construction began in the fall of 1862 on the Yazoo River, Red River, and Biotech for another 6 ironclads, nearly all of these efforts once again proved futile. The lack of suitable construction facilities, scarcity of supplies, and a variety of delays forced the self-destruction of all but one of these ironclads. Only the Missouri was completed in the second wave. Likewise, it was the only ironclad produced on the western waters that still flew the Confederate flag at the war's end. Third, a significant amount of the Confederacy's limited money, shipbuilding resources, and skilled laborers went into converting civilian river steamships into dubious warships, usually armed with few and small cannon and crewed with non-military sailors or borrowed soldiers. Most fought bravely, if ineffectively. Some simply fled as soon as they faced the reality of large, purpose-built Union multi-gun warships operated by trained and experienced officers and crew. The attempt to organize a traditional wooden naval river squadron in the war's first year resulted in improvised and disorganized efforts that failed to keep Union forces at bay and drew resources away from ironclad building. Fourth, the United States exploited its superior manufacturing capabilities, its established professional navy, and a much larger labor pool to create and activate its river squadrons more quickly. These city-class Union ironclads built in late 1861 and early 1862 were powerful. They were not invincible. Of these 10 initial Union ironclads, 2 were sunk by torpedoes, 2 were rammed by the River Defense Fleet and sunk at the Battle of Plum Point Bend, but they were both later salvaged and repaired. Another sank after being rammed in early 1863, and 1 surrendered while fighting the CSS Arkansas. Anyway, this is a 60% loss rate, leading to what-if speculation that perhaps even just a few more of the Confederate ironclads becoming operational might have seriously hampered Union naval efforts in the Mississippi River Valley. And of course, the Union, I'm just editorializing now, the effort by the Union replaced all their damaged and lost vessels and men, and the Confederates never could do that. They could never replace any of their losses. So I'm going to show you the last slide and recommend that you, if you are interested in this book, that you can order it from Savas Beatty's website. And if you use the coupon code Free Media Ship to receive free shipping and a bookplate signed by Neil Chatelain. So again, Savas Beatty website, Free Media Ship to get free shipping on your order, and a bookplate signed by the author. I am going to give you a very short couple of minutes description of what was it I did exactly. I mean, I was the editor of this book. What does that mean? Some people who have gone to the effort and know about publishing their books or getting them published know what editors do. But for a lot of you who don't understand, and you're probably asking, well, my computer does spell checking, right? It even checks grammar. Why do I need an editor? Okay, so here's what an editor does. It isn't spell checking. It isn't even proofreading. You can get other people to do that. What an editor does is basically help organize the book. And here's a couple of things that I did for Neil while we were working together and I was learning about his book. Number one, he had a couple of things that I thought were really important that were repeated over and over again in the book, but there was no explanation about them. You remember I had said about ironclads, cottonclads, floating batteries, monitor, motorboat, blah, 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 all those things. He had all those, and I said, you know, you need to explain what these terms are. And so Neil did so. He did a great job with that and came up with a glossary of terms, vessel types, and weapons that we were able to put at the front of the book, and you can refer to it as you read his book. There was also a list of the organizations. I said there's too many different organizations. You've got the Confederate Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Revenue Service, Louisiana Navy, River Defense Fleet. And then the United States also has a Ram Fleet, Western Gunboat Flotilla, et cetera, et cetera. Again, Neil sat down from his notes, from his research, and put together a great list of organizations. So that's part of what an editor does, is recommend what the writer, the author, needs to have in his book. And then the other thing was helping him to organize his thoughts at the end of the book. He had paragraphs that were better as part of a prior chapter. He had paragraphs that were better as part of the conclusions. And there were also things that he hadn't explained in the conclusions that I had questions about. I'm knowledgeable about the American Civil War, but I was really ignorant of the efforts of the navies, the Confederate Navy and the United States Navy, on the rivers. And so I had read that they were involved in the campaigns and battles along the Mississippi River Valley, but I needed him to explain better and organize better what he was trying to get across in his conclusions and his epilogue. And he did so. Neil did a fantastic job. And so it's like a director in an orchestra, and the orchestra wasn't playing together, and so they had to look at the director, and the director would say what he wants in terms of how loud it's going to be, whether the horns are involved or whether it's the violins and so forth. And that's the kind of thing that an editor does for an author, is help improve his book by getting the author to fill in the things that need to be done for the benefit of the readers. Thank you so much for listening, and I am done with this presentation.